Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's AgriDry customer training webinar. Today's webinar is going to be about the C-Flow, or basically the continuous flow dryer controller that we have. Some of you that's on the call may have our controller on your dryer. So we're going to go through the operation of the controller. And many of you, just like a lot of technology devices that you use maybe once a year, kind of like a combine monitor, use it for a short amount of time each year, and you may forget on how to set those settings up and really what those settings do and the operation of those. So that's what we're going to go through today for our continuous flow dryer controller. Something that you guys can refer to at any time, that you can refer back to. This webinar will be recorded, so you guys will have the option and opportunity to go back and view any of that information on our YouTube at any time. My name is Clint Walker. I'm with AgriDry, and I help service and maintain the dryer controllers through the season. So if you guys need to contact myself, at the end of the webinar there'll be a contact number, both the home office and a mobile number, if you guys need to reach out to us and myself for help on that. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go through some preseason checks and operation as we go through this webinar. So the pre-harvest checks that I try to have the customers do ahead of time before you start moving grain into the dryer, I like to have the guys kind of check it with at least within a week in advance, is power up the controller and make sure everything is reading properly on the controller so that there's no unknowns that is going to halt your operation when you're ready to actually start drying grain. So in that check on the power up of the controller is making sure that all the grain sensors and the plenum sensor are reading properly. And what I mean by that is make sure they're not reading any default numbers. And when I say default numbers, they could possibly read 25 degrees or 255 degrees. Those numbers would present that it's possibly an open connection or a short and not actually reading the sensors properly. So make sure that they're actually reading what the temperature is surrounding those sensors at that time. And it just kind of ensures that when you're ready to start putting grain in the dryer, that you'll actually be ready to go and making sure that they're going to read properly. Another thing that I have customers check is making sure that the moisture sensor, if you have the moisture sensor option on the dryer, making sure that that's fully cleaned off, maybe from the prior year, from any grain that maybe sat on the sensor or debris. So making sure that that's cleaned off and wiped off, so that as you start running into this year's season and future seasons, that as you start making sure that there's no grudge or slime or anything like that obviously can, obviously affect the reading of the moisture sensor. So you can usually we try to mount them so you can drop them out of the bottom of the auger or conveyor, whatever the sensor is mounted on, and making sure that it's all clean and wiped off. And then obviously as grain is cycled across that sensor and moving across that sensor, it helps clean it off as well. If there is a fine layer of hardened slime, I call it, for no better lack of term, I guess, that actually can accumulate on the top of that sensor. And the last thing is if you have the 80-link communication package on the controller, and if that's a way that you monitor the dryer controller from your mobile device, definitely make sure that your subscription is active and making sure that you are ready to communicate with that controller remotely and making sure that everything goes along with that. If you have any questions with the subscription, definitely call our office, the tech support team in the office, and they can make sure that you're up to date in anything that goes along with that on the communication side. So what I tell a lot of guys, and whether it's the very first season that you're actually operating our controller, or really any season, is the recommended startup that I like to see guys perform is starting your dryer in the manual mode from our controller. And what that does is it gives as much time, and I call it maybe work out the bugs out of the dryer, make sure there's nothing that is going to prevent the dryer from running other than what our operation is on the dryer. And that could go as much as make sure there's no gas issues or flame issues, safety circuit issues, anything that obviously we keep all in your dryer still has to have operational for it to perform correctly. So by running the dryer, especially when that first 24-hour period, and sometimes longer, depending on your actual operation and how much grain you have and whatever else. I like the guys to start in manual position from our switches on our controller, start their dryer, and basically run their dryer like they used to without even our controller. And like I said, that just gives the opportunity to display any problems, potential problems on their dryer. And when we're running in manual on our side, it's basically totally bypassing our controller from the automatic conditions and the settings that we have programmed in the controller. So it's mainly based just on your dryer and your dryer functions, and it just gives a good operation and good way to make sure that everything is ready for the season. It also, if it's your first season with our controller, it gives the opportunity for our controller to log with AgriLink, especially, log those average grain temperatures, as well as you can see those on the display when you're running in manual, and watch our AgriDry grain temperature sensors that we have in the drying column. And it really takes the guesswork out of the operation. And what I mean by that is if you run your dryer manually, let's say for a full 24 hours, and you kind of get your dryer dialed in for the season, for the moisture that you have of the grain going into the dryer, and you finally work out the bugs and finally work out the speed of the metering rules of what you need to do in manual, and you get that consistency, you and or we, especially with the AgriLink communication, can look at what that average grain temperature is reading on our controller. And by doing that, if you have the AgriLink communication, we can go back and say, once you've dialed that dryer in, it's up to temperature within that first 2 or 3 hours, and you've consistently now been running at a certain speed, and you have it dialed in for the moisture you have, we can see exactly what that average grain temperature has been being, and so we can program that in as a setting on our controller. So when you're ready to flip over to automatic, it takes a lot of that guesswork and a lot of that automatic control functions, a lot less time to get to the desired temperature, what we need to be for our settings. So it's a good way to identify the temperature of what we need to be working at, because that's usually unknown, especially if your first season. We don't know what that temperature needs to be necessarily at our grain temperatures to come out at the right moisture. And so by running manually, we can see that. I'm going to show a video here just on how to run in manual. So this is a screen of one of our dryer controllers, and this dryer controller is set up with 4 switches. And a lot of you may have 4 switches, some of you may have 3 switches. But you're going to have a switch for the fan circuit, a switch for the heater circuit, and at least one metering roll speed switch. It could, if we're operating your dryer as an on and off, you would just have one switch for your metering rolls. If we're operating your metering rolls as a high-low, then you're going to have 2 switches like it's shown here in the video in the picture here. So when you're running manually, based off of the situation that we have here, 4 switches total, a low speed and a high speed, we're going to flip 3 switches to the manual position, meaning the up position, and we're going to leave the low speed off. If you have just 3 switches, a fan switch, heater switch, and basically a discharge switch, one switch only, then you're going to flip just the 3 switches in manual. So I'm going to play this video. Once you flip it to manual, on our side, that basically closes the circuit that we have our control circuits tied into, and then you're going to go to your dryer and start your dryer like you always did and run your dryer with your controls like you always did. And then when you're ready to stop or come onto the manual position, shut your dryer down, you can either shut it down at your dryer or flip our switches off here, and it should kill those functions that we're tied into. Hopefully that makes sense. So it's very easy to run in manual. Like I said, we're going to flip our switches to manual position, and like I showed in the video, you're only going to, if you have the high load speed option, you're going to flip the fan, heater, and the high speed in manual, leave the low to off. If you have 3 switches total, you're going to flip the fan, heater, and discharge switch to the manual position, and then run your dryer like you always did. All right. So that's the recommended startup and operation for the manual side of getting going and really running your dryer manual at any time. You can always switch to manual control if you need, if something happens on our side, and should be able to run your dryer like you always did at that point. Now, on the automatic control side, here's the 4 steps in this order that needs to happen. And I'm going to show a video more in detail of the settings, kind of explaining what the settings mean, and then when you're ready to switch to the automatic side. But here's a four-step procedure of what has to happen when you're ready to go to the automatic control side with our controller. First, you're going to program all of your settings in the AgriDry controller to your desired numbers, meaning you're going to set up the settings according to what you're controlling on your dryer. You're going to set up your settings as far as your discharge grain moisture, what you're desired. You're also going to set up your discharge temperature and all the other settings that we'll go through here in a little bit with the video. Secondly, once you have all your settings set up, you're going to move all of our AgriDry control switches to the automatic position. So whether you have 3 switches or 4 switches, you're now going to move all of those switches, which I'll show you in the video, all to the automatic position, which would be the down position. Once all 4 switches or 3 switches, however many you have, is in the auto position, you're then going to press the dryer control start line item, which I'll show you also on the video, which basically starts our dryer control program. It starts the operation program on our controller. And once that's started, you're going to wait approximately 5 to 10 seconds for our relays to close on our circuit board for the fan, heater, and whether we're controlling low-speed or high-speed relays or just a discharge relay by itself. And then you're going to start your dryer like you always did from your existing dryer panel. So it's a very easy step-by-step process. It just needs to happen in this order for it to go smoothly and so that a step is not forgotten throughout that process. So those are the 4 steps. Now let's go ahead and look at the settings and kind of explain what each of them do for your application and what not to use and what to use at that point. So if you notice here, this is the main screen. As soon as you power up the controller, your screen probably looks very similar to this. It's a 3-line item. The dryer control start, that's what we're going to press when we're ready to start our controller for the automatic side. But before we do that, we need to go into the setup menus, the dryer setup and the C-Flow setup menu, to program the settings that we're dealing with. Okay? The data selector here is what I'm going to be scrolling through and actually being able to scroll through and check and change settings. So we're going to go into the dryer setup menu first. Once we open that, the dryer ID has to do with communication. So that's always going to be set at 01, especially if you have the 80-link communication. Metric units, not very many people, obviously, especially in the United States, are going to have the metric units on, so that typically that's off. But if you wanted to have the metric units on, obviously that can be turned on at any time. The sensor count. The sensor count is a number of grain sensors that we're actually reading in the grain column and the drying column. All right, so depending on your dryer of what we have set up with our controller, whether it's a conventional dryer or a tower dryer, however many dryer sensors that we have on those probes that actually stick from the outside in, have the boxes on the outside, however many dryer sensors that we are reading into our controller, that's the total number that we're going to program into our count. And obviously once it's set, you should never have to change it, obviously, for what we're actually controlling. We have the ability to turn the plenum sensor on or off. All right, so if you have the plenum sensor option, which most of our dryer controllers do, you're going to leave the plenum sensor on, so we read a plenum sensor. If you already have one in your system, we obviously usually keep that in place as well. We have a plenum limit, which means if our plenum temperature hits this limit, basically throw up an error code and shut the entire dryer down, meaning that temperature has exceeded that limit and there's an issue for whatever reason for what we're controlling. What I like to have that plenum limit set at is about 15 to 20 degrees more than what you typically would be running your plenum temperature at. So if you're running a plenum temperature of, let's say, 210 degrees typically on your dryer for the season, and that obviously may change as you go from the beginning of the season to the end of the season, I would probably have my plenum limit set at least 230 degrees at least, so that we give a little bit of cushion there, and we know if it does exceed 230, there definitely is going to be a problem or an issue that is arising that we definitely need to look at. Okay? Moisture sensor on or off. So if you have the moisture sensor option on the controller, you're going to have that on. And then the 2-speed discharge on or off, if we have just one switch for the discharge on our controller that you're just turning the discharge on and off, meaning the meter rolls on and off, you're going to have the 2-speed discharge setting set to off. If you have a low-speed, high-speed switch on our controller to where we're actually physically changing between two different set speeds, then you're going to have the 2-speed discharge set to on. So those are the settings that, like I said, are pretty much set up from the beginning of the install. And a lot of these, if any, other than maybe the plenum limit, may change, but all the other ones should pretty much stay consistent and never have to change them. So that's everything in the dryer setup menu. We're going to close out of this menu, and then we're going to go into what I call the C-Flow setup menu. And this is more of the operational settings that we're dealing with. Once you open the C-Flow setup menu, the very first setting that we come to is a target discharge grain moisture setting. And this is where you're going to program in what you actually physically want the grain dryer to be bringing out moisture-wise out of the dryer. So if you want 15%, like this customer, we're going to set that at 15%. If you wanted 14.5 or 16 or whatever that number is, it goes by tenths of a point of moisture. You're going to dial that moisture, target grain moisture, either by press and release the knob and scrolling counterclockwise or clockwise and setting it to what you want. Press and release the knob again to choose what you want for the discharge grain moisture. So that's the very first setting, what you want to come out of the dryer at. Now the grain sensors, these are all the different grain sensors that he has on his dryer. Notice they're reading 255 degrees. Now I was actually just physically working on this dryer yesterday, and I actually have the temperatures unhooked from the dryer, and that's why they're reading a default number. We talked about it before. If everything is wired up correctly and performing correctly, if you see these numbers, and you shouldn't be because that's not actually the temperature, this is an alarming point that says, hey, my sensors are not reading properly. I definitely need to have it checked out before I start operating my controller. So, but you notice all these temperature sensors, which this customer actually has 12 around this dryer, but you can actually deselect or select which ones are in or out of the grain. Now, as long as they're all working properly, all of these sensors are going to have an X beside them. But if you happen to have one of the sensors that doesn't work properly, you can remove the X, and by removing it, it still reads it, but it doesn't take it into the average grain temperature. So that's an easy way to deselect something if something does go haywire throughout the operation, even throughout the season. If you have, let's say, 9 out of 10 sensors working properly, you can have 9 of them selected with an X, the 10th one deselected, or whatever one that's not reading properly, and then that way it still gives you an accurate average, and then it can be fixed at a later time when the service techs get in the area. The discharge temperature. Now this discharge temperature is the average grain temperature, that setting that we just looked at before, the reading. The average grain temperature has to achieve whatever this discharge temperature set point is before it starts discharging grain, whether it's an on and off setup that we have set up on your controller for a metering roll on and off, or a low speed, high speed. Once your average grain temperature around the dryer and the dryer drying column achieves this set point, it then, if you have a high speed, low speed, it's going to switch to high speed because we're up to temperature at that point. So as you notice, this customer had 92 degrees, and that's what he ended at last year when he was operating his dryer. The grain was coming out of the field much drier than it was at the beginning season. I believe when he first started out, I think he was running more of a 120, 125 degree temperature set point as well. So that discharge temperature set point can be changed throughout the operation as you possibly get into drier grain, or depending on as you're changing moisture of the grain. And the controller will have some automatic controls functions with this set point that we'll go through a little later if you have the moisture sensor option as well on the controller. So that's what the discharge temperature set point is. Then we have a discharge differential, and that discharge differential is subtracted from your discharge temperature. So in this example, 92 degrees minus 3 is 89 degrees. So what's happening in this situation, he runs a high and low. Once we hit 92 degrees, it's going to switch to high speed. And once it switches to high speed, we're going to start discharging on the high speed setting. It's going to monitor the moisture, and it's going to monitor the grain temperature. And both of those, if it gets outside of the moisture window coming out of the dryer, and the temperature of the grain on our sensors drops back 3 degrees from the set point of 92, meaning it gets back to 89 degrees, it's going to kick back to low speed because we're not up to temperature, and we want to hold that temperature to come out at the right moisture. So that's what that differential is. Most of the time I run it at 2 to 3 degrees, somewhere in that range. It gives a little bit of leeway there. It gives a fairly tight window so that we're not allowing that grain temperature to have very large swings. So typically this discharge differential is 2 to 3 degrees as a default number. And back to the setting above, the target discharge temperature. If you don't know what that number is, a good set point for a starting point, if you don't know what it is 118 degrees. So you start at 118 degrees, and then we can help manually dial that in if we need, once we check some moisture's coming out of the dryer and the dryer's heated up to where it needs to be, or the controller will help automate that process as well. The heater control, on or off, and what that means is, the heater timeout is the next one. Heater timeout is in minutes. And that setting is if we are not up to that target discharge temperature set point within 90 minutes, meaning it's either had the metering rolls off for 90 minutes or it's been on low speed for 90 minutes, we need to shut the dryer down. And that could be whether we're not up to temperature, maybe there's a flame issue, maybe there's a burner issue, maybe the low speed is set, if you have a 2-speed option, maybe the low speed is set too fast and it's not allowing the temperature to get back up to temperature of that temperature set point for our grain sensors. So that's another option that would throw the alarm. But if this heater timeout timer expires of 90 minutes, in this scenario, it's going to throw up an error code and it's going to shut the entire dryer down on the automatic side. Most of the time I don't run it any less than 60 minutes, and depending on the size of the dryer and how long it takes to get up to temperature on initial startup, it could be anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes, but no less than 60 minutes, and sometimes 90 like in this scenario. Heater control. Most of the time of all the controllers that we have hooked up in the field, the heater control is going to be off. The only time that we have heater control on is if we are operating the burners on the dryer as a high-low. And if we have it set to on, it brings up another set point or another setting that you can say, once my grain temperature achieves a higher, let's say 20 degrees higher than what my temperature set point is, kick to low fire instead of high fire so that we kind of can help contain that temperature in the drying column and inside the plenum of that dryer. But most of the dryers that we hook up, it's just into the control circuit of the on and off of the heaters. And so if we have that on and it shuts the burners off, you have to physically go to the dryer and turn it back on, which we don't want. So we always leave the heater control in most scenarios, 99% of the time, leave it in the off mode, and that way it doesn't throw the alarm and doesn't shut the heater off and making you have to go back every time to begin and start that heater back up. The auto adjustment controls, and this is kind of where the moisture sensor comes in with the automatic adjustment. So if you have the moisture sensor option, you can have auto adjustment on, and when auto adjustment is on, it looks at obviously the moisture coming out of the dryer, and then it can help automatically change that target temperature set point. Remember, it was at 92 degrees on this dryer. It can physically automatically increase or decrease that set point just by reading the moisture coming out of the dryer. If it's coming out too dry or too wet, automatically increase or decrease. So on how the automatic adjustment setting works is that you look at this discharge grain moisture, plus and minus. I do not operate usually any less than a half a point. Most of the dryers, for a good starting point, needs to be set at 1.0 for their plus and minus. This particular customer has his set at 1.5 because the moisture coming out of the dryer is a little higher differences, you might say, from their target moisture. So this plus and minus is added to and subtracted to your target grain moisture set point. That very first set point that we looked at was at 15%, meaning I want to come out of the dryer at 15. This plus and minus is added to and subtracted to that 15. So they're shooting for a 13.5 to 16.5% window that allows the moisture sensor to say, I'm within range, don't do any automatic control adjustments. Like I said, especially at startup, set that plus and minus at 1.0, and depending on how accurate and how your grain is moving across the sensor, if you have a fairly tight window that it's operating at, no less do I go at 0.5. Like I said, most of the time I give it a point either direction, so at 15 we'd be shooting for a 14 to 60% window. target temperature adjustment. So every time that the moisture is outside of this range, so we're going to use this range here for the settings that we should see, 13.5 to 16.5 in this example. For every 1.5 that it is outside of that range, meaning if it was coming out at 18%, which would be 1.5 higher than the high side of that window, 16.5, it would change that target temperature set point 3 degrees. So it would increase at 92 degrees, which is the temperature set point for our grain sensors, and increase it 3 degrees. So it would take 92, add 3 to it, so it would be at 95. And so that would use the new temperature set point. It says, I'm coming out too wet. My average grain temperature for my grain at my drying sensors has to be a little warmer to come out a little bit drier. All right, so that's what the temperature adjustment set point is doing. Most of the time, if not all the times, I use 3 degrees. Usually it's because we're operating at usually at 1.0. And so for every point of moisture, I'm changing that temperature about 3 degrees if I want to increase or decrease that. If it was coming out a point or 1.5 too dry, then it would subtract 3 degrees from that 92 in this example, so take it down to 89 and use that as a new set point and keep those metering rolls running to keep the grain moving throughout the dryer and have it set so that it will run at a lower temperature and come out of the dryer faster. So that's how the automatic adjustment works. Now, every time we make an adjustment, we have to allow the time from the grain, wherever your sensors are at on the dryer, the time for the grain from those sensors to get down to the discharge and check it again. So once we make an adjustment on the automatic adjustment side and change the discharge temperature automatically, we're going to wait, in this example, 60 minutes before we can make another adjustment. I do not operate this adjustment lock typically any less than 45 minutes. Most time it's a range from 45 minutes to 60 minutes, depending on how tall your dryer is and how far up those sensors are and how fast you're running the grain through. I'd rather be a little longer than shorter. I want to make sure that grain from those sensors has made it down to the discharge moisture sensor before we make any adjustments whatsoever. So that's the adjustment lock, and that's the lockout that we allow the time for the grain from those sensors to get down to the discharge. The grain type on this particular dryer is just a one-box system. Some of you may have a two-box system that has a moisture monitor inside another box. If you have the moisture monitor inside the other box, you don't have this setting because you set the set point or the grain type on that moisture monitor. The customers that have a setup like this to where it's just one-box system, you have the ability to change your grain type right from the controller here for whatever you're controlling and whatever grain that you're actually running through the dryer at the time of the season. So you can change it at any time by pressing release the knob and change the grain type, set it for what you want. And then the grain moisture calibration, which is the very last setting. If you notice, I'm moving counterclockwise to make it a larger negative number, clockwise to increase, make it closer to 0, or make it a positive number. So you have a negative or a positive control for the grain moisture calibration. The easiest way to do this, and I usually wait till at least an hour of runtime, if not a couple hours of runtime, gives your dryer a chance to warm up, get up to temperature, and everything dialed in for what you're controlling. And then physically take a sample and make sure you do this on the high-speed control side or when your metering rolls are running at the correct speed that you want to be discharging grain moisture at. Take a sample and then compare it to what your actual controller is reading for grain moisture. And if you need to calibrate that, negative or positive, like I said before, as you notice, I moved counterclockwise to make it a negative number or subtract the amount from the moisture, and dial clockwise on the data selector to add that number to the discharge grain moisture set point. So this is a way in the C-Flow setup menu that you can consistently always make sure that moisture sensor is calibrated with actually something that you are physically taking a moisture check that you're hauling grain to town, whether it's a desktop style moisture tester, whatever you're using that you have calibrated to where you're hauling grain, make sure that the controller matches what that is. What guys will get into and maybe make the mistake at is if they have a high-speed, low-speed setup, like this customer does, when the grain is discharging on low speed, there's not as much grain going across that sensor. So you may see that the moisture is reading maybe a little different than what it does when it's on high speed. Do not calibrate the controller when it's running on low speed because it's not pushing as much across that sensor, and the amount of grain across that sensor is not the accurate amount that it needs to be. Kind of no different than your moisture tester on your bench. If you run a half a sample or a three-quarter sample through your tester compared to a full sample, it's going to read different. No different than what we see here. So you need to calibrate it when you're on the high-speed side only. It'll still display grain moisture on the screen on the low-speed side, but that's not accurate. You can just pretend you don't even see it. You might say it's the easiest way to do it because you're not making any adjustments. That number is not even accurate. And like I said, only on the high speed. The controller doesn't use those numbers when it's reading on low speed control, so you don't have to use those numbers, and that's probably the easiest way to explain that. So just like I said, an easy way to calibrate it, positive or negative, to increase or decrease the numbers there. So that's everything in the setup menu. And like I said, those are the default numbers of what we typically run at for what we're dealing with. We're going to scroll back up to the top of the screen, and we're going to get back up to close out of the C-Flow setup menu. And at this time, we would be ready to start the dryer controller in the automatic control side. All right. Now to do this, we need to flip our switches. Remember that 4-step procedure. Number one was set up all the settings in the controller for what we're going to do. Secondly was flip all of our switches on all of our control circuits to the automatic side. So like I said before, this customer has 4 switches. We're going to flip every single switch to the automatic position, which is the down position. That way we're ready to control everything in the automatic side. That's step 2. Step 3 now is we're going to press the dryer control start program, and that basically starts our dryer control program so that it starts running through the automatic program on our controller. And the way to do that is have that at the top of the screen and then press and release the knob to start the dryer program. As soon as you do that, you notice that it goes into what I call the status screen. It shows you the plenum temperature, average grain temperature of all the drying sensors in the drying column. Obviously the discharge grain moisture, when it's ready to, start discharging grain, and the fan status and everything else below it. Now, as soon as you press dryer control start, you notice the fan status says off. It's going to take about 5 to 10 seconds before that status says on. And once that says on, that means our relays in our box has been turned on, and now the circuits are closed, and now you can start your dryer like you always did in the automatic side. So that being said, that was step 3, was start the dryer program, wait about 5 to 10 seconds, make sure that the status says on, and the conveyor speed says something, whether low or high, depending, or on or off, depending on what you're doing and how many switches you have and how you're controlling the dryer with our controller. And then from there, now you're ready to go out and start your dryer like you always did by starting the fans and burners in the procedure that you did, which is step 4 of that PowerPoint that I showed you earlier. So that's the 4-step procedure on starting in automatic controls. So as I scroll through, you notice that conveyor speed says high, and remember I had those sensors on hooks, so that grain temperature is reading 255. It's above our set point, and that's why it changes to high. As you notice, all the fan run times and conveyor speed run times all obviously are going to start accumulating to this point. If at any point you want to close out of this menu, and let's say you want to shut the dryer down, or go into your C-Flow setup menu where you can adjust your calibration for your moisture sensor. That's how you close out and then go into the C-Flow setup menu. If you want to stop the dryer controller and basically shut the dryer down from our controller, you're going to press and release the knob when it says dryer control stop at the top. And when you do that, then it opens all of our relays on our box. And if you're done for the season, you can flip obviously all of our switches back to the off position as well. And obviously any procedure, you can shut it down to the dryer first and come in here, shut it down, whatever you want from that side of it. All right? Let's go back to the PowerPoint here, because one of the last things I want to go over is the error messages that can shut down the dryer controller or your dryer automatically from our side. And there's only 3 errors from our side that's going to shut your dryer down. And it would come up with a message on the screen stating those messages. So that's kind of how you know if your dryer shut down on your side or on our side. If it shuts down on your side, our controller would still display the plenum temperature and grain temperature sensors and all that, and it would not have an error message on the screen. If the dryer shut down and you see one of these error messages on the screen of our controller, then you know that our controller shut it down, okay? Especially if you're there. Now, if your dryer shut down and then ours timed out, let's say an hour later, then it might show one of these error messages as well. So I guess you got to be there, essentially, or see it on the communication through AD-Link, timing-wise of when it shut it down. But here's the 3 error messages. First one is grain temperature average low temp timeout. The second one is plenum temperature high limit exceeded. And the third one is auto adjustment temp out of range. So looking at those error messages, I'm going to open up a video because it shows a little more of explanation. I will explain each one as well. So there's the 3 error messages. On the inside of the door, you probably have a label that looks very similar to this, and that label is those 3 error messages that we just explained. So the very first one, the grain temp average low temp timeout. And what that means is that if you remember that heater timeout, and the set point in this controller, if you remember, was 90 minutes. And so if it's running on low speed for the metering rolls, or it had the metering rolls off for 90 minutes, that timer has expired, meaning we're not up to temperature of the set point of what we need to be at to discharge grain moisture at the correct set point, then it's going to shut the entire dryer down and come up with this error message. And that's the only time when that error message comes up. So you know at that point saying, like I said before, it could be an issue on your dryer, flame, burner, something where it's not keeping up temperature. Or secondly, like I said, if you're operating high-low, if your low speed is set too fast, when we kick the low speed to allow us to catch back up, if your low speed is set too fast, it doesn't allow the grain dryer to catch back up with temperature and get the grain temperature back up to the set point of what we need to be. So that's the very first error message that can shut it down. Second error message, plenum temperature high limit exceeded. Pretty basic. We've already talked about it a little bit. We had that plenum high limit set point, which in this case I think it was set at 250 degrees. If that plenum temperature on our sensor, not yours, but on our sensor hits that high limit that's programmed on the setting, then it's going to shut the entire dryer down. Maybe it's set too low and we need to raise it, depending on what your plenum's operating at. Maybe we don't give it enough cushion. Maybe the plenum temperature has went bad. Maybe something actually physically happened. I usually hear about it, once or twice a year from one of our customers. Something caught fire in the dryer and actually did do its job to where it exceeded, and it shut the entire dryer down, and something caught fire in the dryer. So that's the safety aspect that we want to obviously have in place on our side as well. So that's the second error message that will shut the entire dryer down. The third one is auto adjustment temp out of range. So when you have auto adjustment on, meaning you have it on in the settings using the moisture sensor auto adjustment to where it can automatically increase or decrease your temperature set point, that auto adjustment has a range. And that range, I believe, is like 60 to 80 degrees on the low side and like 200 on the high side, meaning it can increase or decrease from the automatic side, increase or decrease that temperature set point a pretty good range, let's say 80 to 200 degrees. So if it's trying to decrease or increase that number, the temperature set point, because it's coming out too dry or too wet consistently, and eventually it increases that set point too much or too low to get out of range, that's when this auto adjustment error message comes up. I don't think I've ever seen it hit on the high side, meaning it increased the temperature too much. It's usually on the low side. And a perfect example of this is, let's say you're running at the beginning of the season 20 or 22% moisture grain, and later in the season you're running 17 or 18%. If you don't, let's say, change your plenum temperature, physically turn your heat down maybe on your plenum temperature, or have your speed of your metering rolls increase fast enough to pull the grain out of the dryer fast enough, it's going to see that it's coming out of the dryer too dry consistently. And every hour, remember that lockout time, every hour if it sees it's coming out too dry and below your discharge grain moisture window, it's going to say, hey, I need to keep dropping the temperature. I need to keep dropping the temperature every time that lockout timer is exceeded. And as it keeps dropping that set point, as it keeps dropping it and gets down to that 80 or 60 degrees, I think it's 80 degrees, to where it says, hey, I've lowered it so much and we're not doing any good. I've been on high speed the entire time, or had the metering rolls on the entire time on the highest setting possible of what you set it at. Then there's an issue and we can't move the grain out of the dryer. So either A, you need to turn your heat down on your plenum manually from your temperature controls, or you need to increase your set point of your metering rolls on the high-speed setting or on-side if you're running on and off, so that it pulls the grain out of the dryer faster. So that's when I see this error message come up. And so it's very crucial to make sure that you're running your metering rolls fast enough to what you need to do. What I tell the guys when you're running our controller with your dryer functions, before our controller, you're trying to find that perfect speed to come out with the perfect moisture with your metering speed dial on your dryer panel. Increase your high-speed setting or your potentiometer on the high speed if we have a high-low, or if it's on-off. Make sure you're running your metering rolls at a high enough speed, and I tell the guys run it about 5 to 10% faster than what you typically would before whatever moisture you're running. So let's say you're running on a dial of a scale of 0 to 100. Let's say you'd be running at 40 on the dial for, let's say, 22% moisture corn for your dryer. You're going to increase that speed. Instead of running 40 for the high speed setting, you're going to increase it about 10%. So you're going to be running closer to 44 instead of 40. And that little bit, as you well know, you increase that dial a little bit, it makes a big difference. And so increasing that dial a little bit faster, it'll get up to temperature. And normal operation will get up to temperature. You might see that temperature of our grain sensors increase or climb maybe another 5 to 10 degrees, and then it'll gradually and slowly come back down. And that means that we have the metering rules set a little faster to where we have a little bit of leeway with different moistures coming in. As that moisture comes back down, or as I say, not moisture, but temperature comes back down, it's going to get below your temperature set point. In this case, if you remember on the settings, 2 or 3 degrees, and then it's going to kick back to low speed. And once it kicks to low speed, you might see it drop another 5 to 10 degrees very slowly, and then start to increase back up because we've slowed it up enough to start increasing back up the scale. So if you say your high speed setting about 5 to 10% faster than what you typically would, set your low speed about 10 to 15% less, at least. I have, and it depends on the dryer, at least maybe up to 25%. Less than your high-speed setting. So whatever you say your high-speed first, and then say your low-speed 15 to 20% less than your high-speed setting. So that we don't, if you set it too much, then you're going to have large swings of moisture coming out of the dryer, and it just kind of constantly almost work against each other. So we want to keep a fairly tight window to give a lot more consistency coming out of the dryer. So that's how you're going to set your potentiometers for what you want. And like I said, guys, each dryer is different, so you may operate your dryers a little bit differently, even from our side. So if you have any questions about that, like I said, don't hesitate to call myself or call us in the office, and we can definitely walk you through it. We can possibly pull up the 80-link communication if you have that and see exactly what's going on there. So those are the 3 error messages that can come up, and obviously shut the dryer down if we need. And lastly, here's our contact numbers if you need to contact us. And like I said, it's a piece of equipment that you use for a short amount of time, and so I know it's a very stressful point of the time during harvest, trying to get everything dialed in. But our main office number is 855-AgriDry. Mobile number actually for myself, you can see it on the screen, is 419-630-7030. So if you guys have any questions about the dryer side, don't hesitate to call. I probably know a lot of your dryers. I've probably been on site with a lot of your dryers anyways. And, we can work throughout the details of each scenario if we need. So here's our contact information. This webinar, like I said, will be, it's recorded, so you guys can refer back to it at any time about any particular questions that you guys have. Like I said, contact us here in the home office. I'm going to go ahead and open the phone lines in case you guys have any questions while we're on the line. And after that, if I don't hear anything, we'll close for the day and let everybody get on with their busy days. So let me unmute the lines. I will let you know when they're open. The phone line should be open, guys. If you have any questions, do ask them now. Hopefully this has been helpful on just kind of refreshing your minds on operation-wise, and just another avenue that you guys can use from a recorded webinar, as well as some contact numbers that, if you guys need to reach out to us, like I said, don't hesitate to let us know. So I appreciate everyone being on today, and like I said, if you guys need any help whatsoever concerning your dryer controllers, let us know. This webinar obviously was more about our continuous flow dryer controllers. We do have batch dryer controllers out there, so if you guys have any questions on that, I did not do that because it's more of a special, setup or unique setups with those. But if you guys have any questions about the batch dryer controllers and your operation on that, use the same numbers here on the screen to reach out to those folks and myself to get those answers for you as well with your scenario. So thanks again for joining us, and everyone have a great day.